Hi, today we are going to be making the Children's Corner ginger, and I want to go through the pieces with you so that you'll know what pieces to get from your pattern. Essentially, you're going to need all of them. And today we are going to do view A, which is the completely lined view. The bodice is lined in both A and B, but for A, there is a skirt lining too. So this particular pattern piece is labeled numbers 3 and 4, and that's because it is your front skirt piece and it's also the pattern piece for your lining. And if you'll notice up here, it says cut here for skirt front and cut here for the lining, and this is for view A only. So for the skirt, you will cut all the way out here. For the lining, you can just fold this long edge right here and then cut out the lining. Another thing I wanted to talk about are the dots that are at the bottom. These are dots that where you stop stitching when you're stitching the front placket to the front lining, and they are not correct. So what I want you to do is, I'm going to be making a size 4. So I'm going to measure up from that size 4 cutting line up to 7 inches, and then I'm making a new dot there. And while you have this pattern piece out, if you'll just go ahead and do that for each size, move your ruler down to the next cutting line for size 5, measure up 7 inches and do a dot there, and then the same thing with the size 6. The other pieces you will need, this is the pattern for the neck ruffle, and it's pretty straightforward. This is the pattern for the ruffle that goes down the front. And then you have your back bodice and back bodice lining, and then the front bodice and the front bodice lining. There are some marks here that you need to be sure and put on your fabric as well. And so just be on the lookout for those on any of your pattern pieces. This is just a bias band for the neck edge. This is the facing for the front skirt, and then we have the skirt back. And on the skirt back, unless you have a more recent printing of ginger, this is something you will want to change to, just to keep you from being confused. It says skirt back, cut 1 on fold, cut 1 lining on fold. Well, we will be doing that today for this dress because we are lining it and we're doing view A. But if you're doing view B, all you need to do is cut one of your dress fabrics on the fold. So you might want to even make a note on that too. I think that's all for now. So get your pattern pieces out and get them cut out, and then we'll be back for the next step. Okay, now that you've got everything cut out and everything marked, we're ready to start sewing. And so we're starting with step 3, and this is for view A only, which is the view that we are doing. And so what you need to do is you need to take one of your facing strips and sew it to the front edge of your front lining. And this is where that dot comes in, because you're going to stop where you've made that dot on your front skirt lining. So once you have done that, then the next thing you need to do is to press this open and press your seam allowance up here open, but continue pressing 1/4 of an inch down on both the lining and the placket. And then the last thing for step 3 is to trim the skirt lining 1/2 an inch. So now that placket is going to come down 1/2 an inch longer than the skirt lining. After you've done that, then you're going to sew the bodice lining to the bodice skirt, right sides together. And then you'll have your other one. And then you'll also be sewing the skirt to the front bodice. Same way with this one too. both fronts have the bodices and with the skirts gathered on. And then you have the back bodice. You have the back bodice lining, right sides together, quarter or half an inch seam allowance, and then you'll be trimming it to a quarter of an inch. And then same way with the actual dress back. You'll just be sewing your bodice onto your the skirt of your dress back. And then the next thing we're going to talk about is the trim. If you are going straight by the pattern and using the pattern piece for the front ruffle, you will need pattern piece number 8. Now what I've done is I actually, instead of using my dress fabric for the ruffle, I am using a Swiss trim, and it had entre-deux holes all along the scalloped edge, and so I ran some floss through there, just a color that will pick up one of the colors in the dress fabric. I used a tapestry needle, which is a needle that doesn't have a sharp point on it, and it always has a large eye, so it makes it easy to run in and out those holes. And I use all 6 strands of the DMC floss. That takes a while to do that, so sit down and watch a movie while you run your floss through there if you choose to do that. Now this trim is just a little narrower than what I would have liked for it to be. Once you have folded your fabric ruffle using this pattern piece, you will have a 1-inch edge here before the seam allowance. And so I wanted this to be the same as that, and it almost is, but I have to trim these little scallop points off, and so it makes it a little bit narrower than the using the pattern piece and doing fabric would do. But I think it's going to work just fine. So what I did is I did trim off this little scalloped edge of my Swiss trim, and then I took that and gathered it, and now that I can find it, there's the one that there. Okay, so here is the one that I went ahead and put the gathered trim on. So this is what we're doing in step 7. I have taken my trim, I've curved that edge by using this pattern piece, and here's a trim I haven't used yet, and so I laid this on my trim like that, so that the folded edge is on that outer edge of the trim, and then you're going to cut that line right there so that this trim has a curved edge on both ends. Once you've done that, I'm going to go ahead and just trim this because I actually have my trim already sewn on. So once you have that curve trimmed, and I went through, like I said, and just barely cut off these little points so I'd have a straighter edge. So when you gather this trim, or when you gather your fabric ruffle, you're going to start your lengthened stitches here at the point, at that edge, that outer edge, and you'll come around the curve 1/8 of an inch in, all the way along, and then you'll end it the same way, and then come back and do that again about 3/8 of an inch, and then you'll pull this up and gather it to the length that you need. And what you need is you need to put your ruffle on the right hand side of your dress. So you have 2 fronts. You have a left hand front and a right hand front, and the right hand front is the one that you need to stitch the ruffle on. And because my ruffle was a little narrower, I don't know if you can see here, but I actually moved my my trim away from that cut edge. Normally you'd have those 2 matching, just so I could get as much ruffle out of this width as I can. But that's what you're going to do. You're going to lay down your front skirt, your right hand front skirt, and you're going to start the ruffle where you have it marked from your pattern, So I have a blue line here where I knew where to stop. And then there also is a line at the top of the front bodice. And so if you've marked that, then you know that's where you start your ruffle up here. And because this ruffle is curved, when you're gathering, there'll be more gathers right there where we're trying to get that ruffle to curve around to the edge. So just keep that in mind, that right there and again at the bottom, you will have a more dense gathers right there, just so that that ruffle doesn't, sometimes if you don't have enough, it will kind of cup up like that, or sometimes it'll cup under. But if you have enough gather there, then it won't do that. So get that much done, and then we'll be ready to move on. Okay, now that you've gotten your shoulders done and your seam allowance is pressed open, we're ready for the next step. We're ready for step 10. So you're going to put the lining and the dress fabric right sides together. You'll stitch each armhole curve. This one. And this one. And then the fronts are also stitched together down the entire length of the front of the dress. So for the side that has the ruffle on it, you will want to stitch with the wrong side of the dress fabric facing up. And the reason for that is just so you can follow that stitching line from your ruffle. So you'll stitch all the way down to that bottom edge. Even though this is still loose here, that's okay. You still want your facing to go all the way down to the bottom cut edge. Same way on the other side. And then that seam allowance, especially the one at the armhole, you want to clip the curve and trim that seam allowance. And then you'll also want to trim the seam allowance for the front seam. You just don't really need to, there's no reason to clip it. So we're not doing anything with the neck edge right now. It's just strictly the armholes and down the fronts of the dress. So I'm going to get mine done, and then we will move on to step 11. Okay, I'm going to catch you up on what I've done so far. We left off with doing step 10, which was the armhole curve and then the 2 stitching lines down the front of the dress. And so I've done that, turned it and pressed it, and then I did each long side seam. And because we have a lining as well as the fabric, you start at one end, whether it's the lining end or the dress fabric end, it doesn't matter, but you're going to stitch all the way up the skirt, the bodice side seam, the lining side seam, all the way down the lining skirt, and press those seams. Then the next thing I did, after doing all that pressing, I did 1 buttonhole at the top of the dress. The reason for that is so that when you have that ruffle and you have the bias band, it sometimes is very hard to get up in there and do a nice buttonhole. So if you just go ahead and do one now, then you can go back and do the others later. So then the next thing would be to pin the ruffle in place. And if you're doing a fabric ruffle using the pattern piece, you will put right sides together and stitch each end, trim it, flip it, and press it, and then do your gathering threads. Because I'm using this trim, I just hemmed this edge on both ends with a 1/8 inch, just like a shirt tail, top stitched hem. So now I'm ready to start pinning in place. On the right hand side of the dress, the ruffle actually starts at the very edge. And then on the left hand side of the dress, I'm just going to go ahead and bring this over here for now. This trim wants to twist once it's gathered. So then the other end will stop right at that mark that's on your pattern piece. So it'll be approximately 1 inch from this edge, but check and make sure that's correct and put a fabric marker right there so you remember where to stop the ruffle. So I'm going to pin this on and baste this into place, and then we'll be ready for the bias band. Okay, we are almost finished. The last thing I wanted to talk about, actually there's a couple of things, is the ends of the bias band. After you've sewn them on the neckline, trimmed off any excess so that you just have about 1/4 of an inch there. And then your instructions show you how you, with this folded edge of the bias and then this folded edge of the seam allowance of the bias, then you fold it with those right sides together. So you've got a fold and a fold right there. And then I want you to stitch just close as you can to this edge of the dress without actually catching it. After you've done that, you'll trim it to about 1/8 of an inch. And then it'll look like this. So you'll still have a little bit hanging out here, but the seam line is just right there up next to the dress. And then if you will flip that corner so that the bias band is now folded over the inside of the neckline, and then get a point turner or something you can get in there with just to poke that corner out at the top so that this continues just a nice straight line there. And then this will be whip stitched down by hand. And then the other thing I wanted to show you is the hem. And I'm going to unpin mine for just a second. So the first thing you're going to do with the dress fabric is press it 1/4 of an inch. And then press it the 3 inches so that it comes up over top of the facing so that your hemline is at the bottom of the ruffle. And then this hem I usually blind stitch by hand, but you could top stitch it or you could blind stitch it by machine. And then for the lining, it's really the same thing. It's folding it 1/4 of an inch and then 3 inches. And this hem I usually do just top stitch. So after you've hemmed it, then your lining should hang about a 1/2 an inch. That 1/2 an inch that you trimmed off allows the lining to hang about a 1/2 an inch from the bottom edge of the dress hem. I hope these highlights of Ginger have helped you through some of the maybe trickier parts, and I look forward to seeing your Gingers.